Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracul. These are all names that are used to describe this figure, known in Romanian history as Vlad Tepes, but they have also all been used to describe a figure that looks more like this, with the fangs and all, the vampire figure known as Dracula. So in this video I want to look at the life and times of Vlad Tepes. Who was he and what did he do? Vlad Tepes came from what's now Romania, although back in the 15th century when he was alive, it was split into three principalities of Transylvania, Moldavia and Wallachia. The Hungarians who'd come into the region in the 9th or 10th century were key players and had direct control over Transylvania and also nominal control over Moldavia, although often the Moldovan rulers would rule themselves and had a great degree of autonomy there. In Wallachia in the south there was another great influence of power, and this came instead from the Ottomans, who at this time were trying to expand their power base northwards from their recent conquests to the south.
Now some of you might be asking yourselves, what were the Ottomans doing in Eastern Europe in the first place? Well, for a big chunk of the 20th century, historians preferred something known as the Ghaza thesis. Ghaza is simply another word for holy war in Arabic. According to this theory, the Ottomans were able to grow so quickly because it could attract fighters in the name of an Islamic holy war against the non-believers. Thankfully, this idea has gone out of fashion. What I would say is don't look at the Ottomans as being just a Muslim power. We have to bear in mind that the Ottomans only got a foothold in the Middle East about 200 years after the creation of their state. In the beginning, throughout the 14th and even the 15th century, most of the Ottoman conquests were aimed at Eastern Europe, because they viewed themselves as being a European power. Mehmet II, aka the Conqueror, one of his royal title was Kaysar-i-Rum, which means Caesar of Rome, because he genuinely viewed himself as being the successor to the Roman Empire. So in this sense, it shouldn't be too surprising to see the Ottomans' presence in Europe.
Big thank you to Tarek from Hikma History, which is a channel all about the sort of Islamic influence and Islamic history around the Middle East and in Europe and North Africa and other places. He's actually helping me to make this video, and he's making his own video on the Ottomans in Eastern Europe, more specifically in Romania with the conflict in the 15th century. So I'd highly recommend going and checking that out. There'll be a link in the description as well as a card that you can click on to follow and go and have a look at some of his stuff, which I would really highly recommend you do. He's also going to be appearing later on in the video. Now, as Tarek explained, the Ottomans started to expand into Europe as they believed that they were themselves a European power, and they demanded tribute from the peoples of Wallachia and other areas they conquered that was known as the Devshirme. And in this kind of tribute that they would demand, this was actually known as the blood tax or the blood tribute, and they would take young boys from the villages and train them up in the Ottoman way of warfare and train them to become janissaries. But often the peoples of these areas, especially Wallachia, were very unhappy with this situation of affairs and would rise up against them, often with Hungarian support. Now, within Romania itself, there were two noble houses of voivodes, as they were called, these dukes or rulers. One was the house of Danești, and the other was the house of Draculești. Both were actually descended of one house, the house of Basarab, but this was a disputed succession that was being fought. And in 1431, one of the claimants from the house of Draculești moved to the town of Sighișoara, and his name was Vlad Dracul.
It was the son of Mircea the Elder, and it was the father of Vlad Tepes.
So is that Corvin Mica's grandfather then?
Oh, right. Then it's not Tepes, it's Tepes' father.
Right.
Vlad Dracul.
Look at the years, 1431, 1435. Vlad Tepes ruled like about 15 years, 10 to 15 years later.
No, I didn't know.
Or even 20.
I didn't know
So it's his
father
dad, not Vlad Tepes himself. Vlad Tepes obviously being Dracula.
Yeah.
Watching that actually reminds me that I should be saying Tepes rather than Tepes, because the T in Romanian is kind of between a T and a TS and an S sound. It's also actually where we get the name Dracula from, because this is actually the genitive form of the name Dracul, which means dragon, and the reason that Vlad Tepes' father Vlad Dracul is called Vlad the Dragon is because he was a member of the Order of the Dragon, which was a Christian fraternity hell-bent on stopping the Ottoman expansion into Europe.
In 1442, the Wallachian voivode Vlad II Dracul was summoned to the Ottoman royal court at Edirne. Whilst he was released after a year or so, his two sons remained behind as hostages to make sure that their father remained loyal. Prince Radu and Prince Vlad would both spend a number of years in the Ottoman realm, being educated by the Turks, learning the Turkish language. During this time, they were undoubtedly in contact with the future Ottoman Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror. Not much is known definitively about the captivity of the two princes, but we do know that only after 4 or 5 years Vlad was released to contest the Wallachian throne in the aftermath of his father's death, whilst Radu stayed behind in the Ottoman Empire for the next 15 years, moving up through the ranks of the Ottoman army.
As Tarek said, in 1448 Vlad was allowed to leave Ottoman captivity as his father and elder brother were killed by a member of the House of Danest called Vladislav, who was being helped by the Hungarians. And so, while the alliances had shifted once again, the Ottomans were helping the House of Draculesti because the House of Danest, which was then ruling in Wallachia, was being helped by the Hungarians. So while the Ottomans and the Hungarians were fighting each other at the decisive Battle of Kosovo, this is when Vlad saw the opportunity and marched an Ottoman army into Wallachia and reclaimed his possessions, although soon afterwards he was forced to flee as Vladislav returned despite the fact that the Ottomans won the Battle of Kosovo, and he once again had to leave for exile in the Ottoman Empire. However, after a short time in 1456, he appears again in Brasov, which is in Transylvania, which was at that time part of Hungary, and the allegiances had shifted once again as he was now being commanded by the King of Hungary, John Hunyadi, to look after the frontier lands with Wallachia, which was allied with the Ottomans in the south. So now he'd switched sides once again, and from this position, because now the House of Danest was being supported by the Ottomans as they were ruling in Wallachia, now the House of Draculest was being supported by the Hungarians, and so Vlad Tepes once again invaded Wallachia, this time with Hungarian support, and seized the throne, killing Vladislav in a decisive battle. Contemporary chroniclers report that Vlad had many thousands executed when he came to the throne, adding to his bloody reputation. Now we also find that in 1456 that Vlad has a certain trouble with the burghers of the towns of Brasov and Sibiu. Now this was because the Hungarian king, obviously Transylvania was at that time part of the Hungarian March, died. John Hunyadi died, and there was a power struggle for the throne afterwards. And while Vlad supported some of the rebels, many of the people in these towns, especially the Transylvanian Saxons, who were Germans who had been moved over by the Hungarians to this region, were loyal to the king, and so he raided several of the villages, and we're told by chroniclers that he took men, women and children from the Saxon villages and had them impaled on spikes, that there was a forest of spikes of these enemies of Vlad, and that's where he gets the nickname Vlad Tepes, which is Vlad the Impaler in Romanian. Through his heavy-handed tactics and his successful battle strategies, Vlad was able to defeat the pretenders in Wallachia and to restore the peace between himself and the new rulers of Hungary. Although the peace was not to last, as shortly afterwards we are told that he refused to pay the tribute to the Turks, and when the Ottoman Sultan sent 2 men to capture him and to execute him, he instead intercepted them, captured them, and sent their heads back. Now this of course was the asking for a war, and the war would certainly come. And actually he was the first to make a move, because he went up to a Turkish garrison at the town of Giurgiu, and he, in fluent Turkish, ordered that the commander open up the gates, and of course the commander did not expect that this person speaking fluent Turkish, because of his time in imprisonment there, was going to be an enemy of the Turks, but it allowed the Wallachian army to march right into the middle of the fortress and to capture the city. Now this enraged the Sultan at the time, Mehmed II, and he amassed an army that was described as being over 150,000 strong, the largest Ottoman army ever assembled, apart from the one that had broken into Constantinople several years earlier. With the large Ottoman army coming closer, Vlad retreated across Wallachia, employing a scorched earth policy, until he came to the royal site of Târgoviște, where the Ottoman army was camped. Now he had a grand plan, and in the night of the 16th of June, he attacked the camp in the middle of the night with flaming torches and tried to capture the Ottoman Sultan. although he narrowly missed the Sultan's tents and instead was able to capture and kill many of the officials and senior ranking men in the Turkish camp. He was not able to kill the Sultan, and so ultimately the aim of the attack failed. However, it was certainly a blow against the Ottoman army that was chasing Vlad across Wallachia, but he had to retreat once more. However, when the Turks retreated through Wallachia, they were met with a very grisly discovery, as one of the chroniclers describes. The Sultan's army entered into the area of the impalements, which was 17 stades long and 7 stades wide. There were large stakes there on which, as it was said, about 20,000 men, women and children had been spitted, quite a sight for the Turks and the Sultan himself. The Sultan was seized with amazement and said that it was not possible to deprive of his country a man who had done such great deeds, who had such a diabolical understanding of how to govern his realm and his people. And he said that a man who had done such things was worth much. The rest of the Turks were dumbfounded when they saw the multitude of men on the stakes. There were infants too, affixed to their mothers on the stakes, and birds had made their nests in their entrails. Despite fighting several battles against the invading Turks and his brother Radu, who was fighting on the Turkish side, and winning these battles, many of the Wallachians started to desert towards Radu and the Ottoman side, and so Vlad was forced to flee across the Carpathians, looking for support from the Hungarians. However, the Hungarians, who had been treacherous towards him and his family before, were once again deceitful, and instead of helping him, they captured him and imprisoned him, beginning in Alba Iulia. Vlad remained a Hungarian captive in Hungary for many years, until in 1475 the leader of the third and final principality that we haven't yet mentioned, Moldavia, Stefan Ciumare, or Stephen the Great in English, wanted to strengthen the border to the south of Wallachia and impose someone there who was anti-Ottoman and therefore pro-Moldavian and pro-Hungarian. And of course, Vlad was a claimant to the Wallachian throne, and so this would make sense. So he sent envoys to Transylvania to the Hungarian king, asking him to release Vlad so that he could once again invade Wallachia and install a pro-Christian leader there, and one who would fight against the Ottomans. And it's during these attempts in the various battles that were fought against the Ottomans that Vlad Tepes met his end fighting against the Turks, as he had done for most of his life. And it's also because of his very cruel way of dealing with several of the peoples that he fought, the Saxons initially and then the Turks and Bulgarians as well, especially with the impalement and his very hard rule, that we then get this image that spread westwards, especially because of his atrocities committed against the Saxons, who were in contact with the German-speaking world. These legends went westwards, and that's how eventually this guy became the person we now know as Dracula, the story that was inspired, very loosely albeit, on Vlad Tepes, this Romanian warrior who fought against the Turks and the Hungarians and the Moldavians and the Saxons and pretty much everyone in the area. But that is how the two are related. So I really hope you have enjoyed this one. I've never really done much Eastern European history, but I was actually in Romania, as you can tell from the little bits of vlogging in here, and I'd really like to share some more of the history over there because I thought it was absolutely fascinating. Again, a big thank you to Hikma History for helping me on this video and for agreeing to collaborate. I'd highly recommend going and checking out not only his video on this topic, but also his other videos on lots of different topics, because I think you'll find things that you'll find very interesting over there. Anyway, I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History. Thanks very much for tuning in, and don't forget to have a great day.